You're listening to Stories of the Master. The stories of Jesus have reached into the hearts of millions. They have changed people, families, and nations. Not all have loved the stories Jesus told. Not all have honored the life he lived. Some were angry with him, the things he did and the things he said. Others were deeply moved and found hope. What will your response be? Today on Stories of the Master, the widow who would not be silenced. And we find our story in Luke 18, 1 through 8. I hope you will follow along in your own Bible. My name is Jonathan, and I will be your storyteller and teacher. I'm so glad you're here. Gather your friends, come close, and listen. It's time for the world to hear again the stories of the Master. And now, the widow who would not be silenced. Jesus and his disciples were eating a meal with a group of religious leaders. It should have been a more festive occasion, but the disciples were quiet. They seemed concerned and worried. It was not that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were present. Often they caused Jesus problems, testing him, trying to trap him, accusing him unjustly, calling him shameful names. No, on this occasion the concern of the disciples was not because of what the Pharisees said. It was because of what Jesus had said. Earlier in the day, the Pharisees had asked Jesus when the kingdom was coming. Jesus replied that the kingdom had already come. Not completely, but that the kingdom had been inaugurated in his life and in his ministry. He healed the sick. He gave sight to the blind. He made the lame walk. He cast out evil spirits. And above all, he forgave sinners and renewed their relationship with the living God. How blessed it was to see Jesus do these things and to hear him speak as he did. But Jesus also talked to them often about his death, and the disciples did not like that. They did not understand it, and it confused them. They believed the Messiah should be glorious and live. They believed the Messiah should rule Israel from Jerusalem. They believed the Messiah should drive the Romans out of the land. But Jesus kept talking about dying and some kind of resurrection on the third day that would vindicate him. It was all so confusing. Jesus talked about something else that was troubling to them: the coming judgment upon his people. He had said that not all would be saved. Some would be taken to judgment. He described the judgment like great carrion birds circling, waiting for the victims to die so they could feed on the flesh, and all because of their sin. It was a horrifying picture. The meal continued in silence, and a sense of gloom covered them all. Finally, Jesus asked, "Why are your hearts troubled?" And one of the disciples answered, "Lord, when you talk of this judgment upon our people, and when you talk about your suffering, how can we not be troubled? How can we not be saddened with the thought of you being taken from us in the coming judgment upon Israel?" And another said, "Master, it makes me afraid." And then Jesus said, "Let me tell you a story. This will lift your hearts." Not far from here lived a woman with her husband and small children. They were both righteous. They feared God and loved their neighbors. The man owned a small field surrounded by a great estate. He worked it diligently and made enough to provide for his family. But the years took their toll on him, and he aged quickly and weakened from his long labor in the field. In the same village was a wealthy landowner. He had much land and many servants. He was also greedy and was always trying to gain more. Many times he tried to obtain the small piece of land that the man owned, but the man would not sell it. As small as it was, it had been in his family for generations, and he aimed to hold it and pass it to his children. But the greedy landowner kept plotting and scheming to take it away from him. And then the unthinkable happened. One evening, the husband did not return home from his field. His wife became worried. She put her small children into the care of a friend and went to the field to search for her husband. And there she found him, dying from the heat, from the exhaustion of the long years of labor, and from worry over the wealthy landowner who had threatened his inheritance. After the woman buried her husband, it did not take long for the wealthy landowner to approach her. "My dear woman, my friend, how sad we all are that your husband has met such an untimely death and has left you alone with your small children. How will you care for yourself? Who will work your field? I have good news for you. Before he died, your husband approached me and offered to sell the land to me. It is a good price that he asked, and I agreed to the price." But before he could name the price, the woman scoffed at him and said, "My husband would never sell this land to anyone, especially to you." A few days later, the wealthy landowner returned. But this time, he tried a different strategy. He said, "I have offered you a price for your land, but you will not sell." And the woman quickly replied, "Even if I were to sell, I would not sell it at the price you are offering. Your price is a travesty. It is unjust and a mockery before God." The landowner smiled and continued, ignoring the woman's sharp words. It has come to my attention that there are some, how shall I put it, irregularities in the deeds of trust for your land. I must soon go to the judge in our village and tell him of these irregularities if you do not sell to me at the generous price I have offered. You know of this judge. You know what he will do when he is, well, properly motivated to make certain decisions. The land will be taken from you, and you will lose everything. You and your children will have nothing." And then he walked away, laughing at her weakness in a world of powerful men. The woman trembled. She knew of the judge in her village. He was an unrighteous man, and he was easily bribed. She knew the wealthy landowner could present a formidable legal case against her, and that she, a woman, would stand little chance in a court proceeding against him. She also knew that the wealthy landowner would bribe the judge with generous sums of money. Her fear grew. She thought of her children, and she knew there was only one thing she could do. She must appear before the judge, and, as wicked as he was, she must cry out to him for legal protection. The next day, the judge came to the village gates, where he would arbitrate the many cases that the people would bring before him. The judge walked slowly to his seat, lifted high on a platform before the people. He was an obese man, and dressed luxuriously. He ascended to his seat and eased his enormous body upon the many pillows placed there for his comfort. His eyelids drooped, dull from too much wine and too much food, and they showed boredom with the complaints people brought to him for judgment. Many had gathered at the gates to present their claims. What a bother these people are. How I wish I could go back to my palace and avoid all these trifling affairs. The judge was surrounded by his aides. These also were wicked men who took bribes for the judge and decided which cases he would hear. The people lined up, and they called out their requests, but the judge ignored them all until one of them approached his aides and discreetly passed money to one of them. The aide went to the judge and told him of the bribe, and the judge said, "Yes, I will hear his case." The person's name was called. He presented his case and received a favorable ruling from the judge. The widow surveyed the situation. It looked impossible. She was a woman. She lived in a world controlled by powerful evil men, and she was a widow. In her village, wicked men circled widows like wolves surrounding a lost lamb. She had little money, and the judge ruled only by bribes and gifts, for he did not love justice, had no heart to advance honor, and cared not that his actions were shameful. This man, this judge, did not fear God or have any respect for people. But the woman was undaunted. She laid aside her fears, and in the presence of all the men at the village gates, she began to cry out to the judge, "Give me legal protection from my opponent. You must hear my case. Give me legal protection." The large judge looked in the direction of the widow, slightly amused. He turned to one of his aides and motioned for him to get rid of her. The aide got up, took the woman by the arm, and held out his hand as if he were asking her for something, but she angrily pulled away from him and walked away. The judge was watching. He laughed and went back to his business of receiving bribes. But the next day, the woman was back. No sooner had the large, sleepy, uncaring judge sat himself upon his cushions than the woman was there screaming at him, "Give me protection from my legal opponent!" She would not be quiet. She cried out louder than all the men. And again, the judge motioned for one of his aides to have her leave. This went on for some time. Day after day, the judge would sit and render decisions for the people, profiting from their bribes. And day after day, the woman would be there shouting out to the judge. Nothing could stop her. They could not ignore her. They could not treat her shamefully in public. Their threats against her had no power, and it seemed they could not outlast her. She was determined to get her way with the judge, and she was going to make life miserable for him until he did something. Finally, one day, the judge arose in the morning. He usually arose thinking about how he would enrich himself from the bribes of the people. But on this day, the judge had a headache. "That woman," he said, "that woman is wearing me out. She's making me look bad. She's making me ill." He called to one of his aides. "Listen, you know we don't make a ruling unless someone gives us money. You know that I care not for people, and that I don't believe in some God and his justice that I'm supposed to dispense. But this woman keeps coming to me and crying out. She is making my life miserable. If she comes again today, even if she continues to refuse to give us money, bring her to me, and I will rule in her case." And so the judge and his aides prepared themselves for the day's work. With great pomp, they paraded through the village to the gates. They prepared the platform with the great cushions upon which the judge would sit. As they did this, they looked upon the crowd that was forming, and there in the front was the woman, with a look of determination on her face. The judge sat, and one of the aides said, "This court is now in session." And just as the woman started to cry out for the judge to protect her, one of the aides came up to her and said, "The judge will see you." The woman smiled. She took a deep breath, collected her thoughts, approached the judge, and said, "You know my husband. You know how hard he worked. You know that land is ours. My opponent, the wealthiest landowner in this area, is trying to take it from me. This is all I have. You must stop him. You must give me protection." And the judge leaned down toward her and said, "If I do this, will you stop coming to this place and screaming at me?" And the woman answered, "If you give me legal protection, I will never come here again." The judge breathed a sigh of relief. He turned to one of his aides, gave him some instructions. The aide wrote some things on a parchment, gave it to the woman, and said, "Here is what you have asked for." And the woman, with a look of triumph in her eyes, turned and faced the crowd. The men quietly parted, and the woman walked through the multitude of men, victorious in her quest for justice. Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Williams, the creator of and storyteller for Stories of the Master. I'm so glad you've joined us today for our story of the widow who would not be silenced. There's so much to learn from it, and in a moment we will explain what it all means. But first, we hope you will write to us and let us know how these stories are encouraging your life. You can reach us at P.O. Box 90047 in San Antonio, Texas 78209 in the United States. Also, check out our website at storiesofthemaster.com, where you will find many resources to help you in your discovery of Jesus. Well, let's get back to our story now. Jesus has just finished telling the story of the widow trying to gain legal protection. He was telling it to encourage his disciples. Let's see how he applied the story to them and how he will apply it to us. When Jesus finished the story, he looked upon his disciples and said, "Let me explain this to you. Let me encourage your hearts. The unrighteous judge did it. He granted her request. Even though he did not fear God or have concern for granting justice to people, he still did what she asked. And I say to you, if that unrighteous judge gave her justice, don't you think that God in heaven, your Father, who is good and who loves you, will bring about justice for his chosen ones? Of course he will. He will keep the covenant with you. He will bring about his covenant righteousness. He will bring his covenant justice in your behalf. You should be like the woman. Although she feared, she did not let her fear control her. She cried out to the judge every day. And you should cry out to your Father day and night. Even though you are not perfect, he will be patient with you. He will keep his anger far from you. He will bring about justice for his chosen ones. I have shared with you that I, the Son of Man, the Heavenly One, will be vindicated. Yes, I will suffer, but God will vindicate me. I trust him, and he will raise me. In the same way, you must trust him. Do not give in to your fear. Have faith in God. But I ask, when the Son of Man comes, when the Son of Man is vindicated in the difficult days that will come, will he find you with this kind of faith? Will he find faith on the earth? That was a great question Jesus asked his disciples. And it is a question he asks us. As Jesus looks upon the earth today, does he find faith? Let's see how this story applies to our life. First, the story reminds us, painfully, that we live in a fallen world. The disciples were fearful. Jesus told the story because the disciples were under stress. The disciples were in danger. Jesus was in danger. The political authorities were keeping a wary eye upon him. We must remember that Herod knew about Jesus' activity and was keeping a watchful eye because he feared that he might cause disturbances in the land. Pilate was the cruel and ruthless Roman governor. He would stop at nothing to keep order. And if he learned of this movement of people following Jesus and determined that it was causing problems, he would bring it to a swift end. The religious rulers were following Jesus and hounding him, trying to trap him with silly questions and discredit him in the eyes of the people. Many of them were plotting to arrest Jesus and kill him, and those who were his closest followers would receive no mercy either. There was indeed much to be afraid of. Such fears were also true for those who were vulnerable, and who was more vulnerable than widows and orphans. God in his word set down laws that his leaders should protect them. In the book of Exodus we read, "You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry." The prophet Isaiah said, "Learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." Such commands and circumstances remind us that they and we live in a fallen, difficult world. Second, the story reminds us that though God has given specific commands to help those who are weak, our leaders do not always do this. Sin not only affects the hearts of individuals, but it also affects the government systems we have in place so that justice is not dispensed. The story of the unjust judge revealed what was true in the ancient world and in ours. Judges and leaders often do not carry out their God-given responsibility to enact justice. Many are like the judge in the story who did not fear God and who did not respect man. This judge had no sense of honor and shame. The prophet Isaiah, after he exhorted the people to dispense justice and to protect the widow and orphan, said, "Your rulers are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. They do not defend the orphan, nor does the widow's plea come before them." Yes, our world is filled not only with fallen people, but with fallen and sinful government systems that oppress the poor. Third, the story tells us that even though we live in a fallen world, sometimes good things do happen. The widow got her wish. She did receive legal protection, and the reason she did so was because of her persistence in crying out for it. Her persistence is a lesson for us to persist in our faith and in our prayer. This was the lesson Jesus gave to his disciples. Like the widow, do not give in to fear. Like the widow, keep crying out to God. Many of us have fears that surround us. Jesus' disciples were fearful because Jesus kept talking about dying, and they knew if he was killed, they would probably be killed too. But Jesus did not want them to give in to fear. Instead, he wanted them to pray. What are your fears? Do you feel vulnerable and weak? Jesus encourages you to cry out to God day and night over those things that bother you, that trouble you, that make you afraid. In the story, In the ancient record in Luke 18:1, Jesus said that at all times we should pray and not lose heart. The New Testament is filled with exhortations to pray and to keep on praying. In Acts 1:14, we find that after Jesus was enthroned at the right hand of God, his followers met together and devoted themselves to prayer. We find in Acts 2:42 that the first followers of Jesus devoted themselves to 4 things: teaching, worship, fellowship with one another, and praying. When the church became very large, the apostles asked the members to appoint 7 men to help them in caring for the widows in the church so that they could spend more time in prayer. Paul told the Roman Christians to be devoted to prayer. To the Christians in Ephesus, Paul said, "Pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Stay alert and be persistent in your prayers for all believers everywhere." To the Christians living in Colossae, he said they should devote themselves to prayer with an alert mind and a thankful heart. Finally, there was one more lesson for us. The unjust judge granted the woman her request at last. Jesus wanted to drive home the point that our Father is not unjust. He is the righteous God. He is the just judge. He is the one from whom all just laws come. He does care for people. He is concerned about honor and shame. He does want to meet needs. He is not partial. He takes no bribes. He is full of love, concern, and compassion for the needs of all mankind. If the unjust judge could be moved by the constant pleas of a widow, how much more will the just judge of all the earth, the compassionate God, the Heavenly Father, be moved by the cries of his people? Jesus guarantees that all prayers will be answered. Some will be answered quickly in our life. Some will not be answered until he returns. But justice will be done for all. And even though we come to him imperfectly, he has great patience with us. He is merciful and kind to us. The widow who would not be silenced. It is a story of sorrow, a story of injustice, but a story of perseverance in crying out for what is right. It is a story to encourage us, to lift our hearts and strengthen our faith. The question we must answer is, when the Son of Man comes, will he find our hearts full of such faith? Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Williams. Thank you for listening to our story today, The Widow Who Would Not Be Silenced. Jesus told this story to help us overcome our fears and to create faith in our hearts. I pray that you will call out to him now and ask him to reveal himself to you. And when he does, I pray that you will receive him into your life and allow him to reign over you through Jesus. If you need more information about following Jesus, write to us at P.O. Box 90047 in San Antonio, Texas 78209 in the United States. We hope you will check out our website, storiesofthemaster.com, where you will find many resources to help you in your discovery of Jesus. It has been a joy to bring this story to you today. I hope you'll join us again for another story of the Master. Until then, may the Master himself richly bless you.